Standing at the altar in a thrifted $200 lace gown, I listened to my future mother-in-law loudly whisper that I looked like a desperate charity case. She snickered, certain she had finally broken my spirit and proven I didn't belong in her elite world. She didn't know about the phone call I had made the night before. Her smug smile vanished permanently when the heavy oak doors of the cathedral violently swung open and 50 armed royal guards marched down the aisle. Sweeping the hardwood floors of a cozy little independent bookshop in Mayfair, London, was my daily sanctuary. My name is Chloe, and for the past 3 years, I had lived a meticulously crafted lie. To the world, I was a struggling university graduate from a nameless town working for minimum wage and living in a tiny flat with terrible plumbing. I wore vintage clothes, drank cheap instant coffee, and kept my head down. Nobody knew my real last name. Nobody knew that my grandfather was the reigning monarch of a sovereign European state, or that my trust fund alone could buy the entire block my bookshop sat on. I had walked away from the crushing pressure, the paparazzi, and the suffocating royal protocols because I wanted one thing my family could never give me: a normal life where I was loved for exactly who I was not, for my crown or my bank account. That was when Liam Harrington walked into my life. Liam was the heir to a massive shipping empire, a man who possessed that effortless old money confidence. He was tall, possessed striking green eyes, and had a smile that completely disarmed my usual defenses. We bumped into each other in the historical fiction aisle, and from that very first coffee date at a modest cafe down the street, I was hopelessly in love. Liam was charming, attentive, and seemingly grounded despite his massive wealth. He didn't care that I supposedly had nothing. He loved my passion for literature, my quiet demeanor, and the simple life we built in my cramped apartment. I planned to tell him the truth about my royal lineage eventually, but the longer I waited, the harder it became. I just wanted to be normal Chloe for a little while longer. Everything shattered the night he took me to his family's sprawling estate in Surrey to meet his mother, Eleanor Harrington. Eleanor was a terrifying force of nature, a woman who treated social climbing as an Olympic sport. She was draped in vintage Chanel, sipping a glass of extremely rare Bollinger champagne, and looked at me as if I had just crawled out of a sewer. Liam had warned me she could be a bit intimidating, but nothing could have prepared me for the sheer psychological warfare she unleashed. During that first dinner, surrounded by original Picasso paintings and antique silver, she immediately went on the offensive. She interrogated me about my pedigree, my parents' professions, and my non-existent connections in high society. When I politely explained that my family lived abroad and lived very quiet, private lives, she literally laughed out loud. She turned to Liam and, in front of 12 other wealthy guests, said, "Oh, darling, you've picked up a stray. How delightfully charitable of you." Tapo sapro. Liam awkwardly laughed it off, squeezing my hand under the table, but he didn't defend me. That was the first red flag, but I was so blindly in love that I ignored it. Over the next year, Liam and I grew closer, and he finally proposed to me on a rainy Tuesday in Paris. I was ecstatic. I thought our love could conquer his mother's endless cruelty. But the moment the engagement ring, a beautiful but modest sapphire Liam had chosen himself, slid onto my finger, Eleanor initiated a campaign of absolute terror. She immediately hijacked the wedding planning, deciding that the Harrington heir was not going to marry a nobody in a quiet ceremony. She booked St. Paul's Cathedral for the ceremony and the Savoy Hotel for a massive 500-guest reception. I had absolutely no say in the menu, the flowers, or the guest list. The true nightmare, however, began with the wedding dress. Eleanor insisted we visit a hyper-exclusive bridal boutique on Bond Street. When we arrived, she sat on a velvet sofa, sipping espresso, while attendants brought out gowns that cost upwards of £80,000. I fell in love with a stunning, understated silk gown by a famous designer. I stepped out of the dressing room, tears in my eyes, feeling like a true bride. Eleanor slowly lowered her teacup, her eyes raking over me with undisguised disgust. She looked at the boutique owner and sighed. It's entirely too elegant for her. She lacks the posture and the breeding to carry off real silk. Besides, I'm absolutely not spending my money on a dress for a girl who brings nothing to our family. I froze humiliated as the attendants awkwardly looked away. I quietly told Eleanor that I could pay for my own dress. She scoffed, her voice echoing in the quiet boutique. With what, Chloe, your minimum wage bookstore salary? Don't be pathetic. She stood up, grabbed her Hermes Birkin bag, and walked out, leaving me standing in the expensive gown I could never afford on my fake budget. Crying, I took the dress off, thanked the horrified staff, and left. I decided right then and there that I wouldn't take a single penny from Eleanor Harrington. The next day, I went to a quiet vintage shop on the outskirts of the city and bought a simple $200 lace dress. It was beautiful in a rustic, humble way. When I proudly showed Liam a picture of the dress on a hanger, he looked nervous. When Eleanor found out, she was absolutely livid, screaming that I was going to turn her family into a laughingstock. Little did she know, the true laughingstock of this wedding was not going to be me. Tension leading up to the wedding week was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Eleanor had made it her personal mission to ensure I felt entirely isolated and unwelcome. Since I was keeping my royal identity a secret, I couldn't invite my actual family to the wedding without blowing my cover. I had told Liam that my parents were estranged and couldn't make the trip, which only gave Eleanor more ammunition. She constantly loudly lamented to her friends that her son was marrying an orphan with zero social standing. She even went as far as inviting Liam's ex-girlfriend Caroline Brooks, a wealthy aristocratic heiress who Eleanor had always wanted Liam to marry. Caroline was seated at the head table for the rehearsal dinner, completely ignoring me while blatantly flirting with Liam. That rehearsal dinner at the Dorchester was the moment my patience finally shattered into a million pieces. The dining room was dripping in crystal chandeliers and imported white orchids. I sat quietly in a simple black cocktail dress, trying to ignore the whispers and side eyes from Liam's extended family. Then Eleanor stood up to give a toast. She tapped her crystal champagne flute, silencing the room. She smiled warmly at Liam, then her eyes flicked to me, turning ice cold. "We are all gathered here to celebrate my son." She began, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Liam has always been so generous. Ever since he was a little boy, he had a habit of rescuing injured birds and bringing them home. It seems he never lost that charitable streak." The room erupted into polite, cruel chuckles. Caroline smirked at me from across the table. Eleanor continued, "While some girls dream of a fairy tale wedding, others are just lucky to be allowed into the castle. We can only hope Chloe eventually learns how to behave in polite society, though considering her cheap thrift store wedding dress, I won't hold my breath. A toast to charity, Sagai." I felt the blood rush to my face. I looked at Liam, desperately waiting for him to stand up to take the microphone to tell his mother she had crossed the line. Instead, he just looked down at his plate. His face flushed, and took a nervous sip of his wine. He leaned over to me and whispered, "Just let her have her moment, Chloe. She's just stressed about the planning. Don't make a scene." That was it. That was the exact moment the illusion broke. I wasn't just marrying Eleanor's cruelty. I was marrying Liam's cowardice. I realized I was about to tie myself to a family that would spend the rest of my life trying to crush me into dust, and a man who would never stand up to protect me. I excused myself from the table, locking myself in a lavish marble bathroom. I stared at my reflection in the gilded mirror. I had played the humble, quiet girl for 3 years. I had endured the insults, the snobbery, and the sheer arrogance of the Harrington family because I thought love was enough. But I was not a stray bird. I was a royal by blood, raised in palaces that would make the Harrington estate look like a garden shed. I pulled out my phone and dialed a highly encrypted private number I hadn't called in over 2 years. The line clicked, and a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Protocol office." I took a deep breath. "This is Her Royal Highness Princess Chloe. Connect me to my grandfather immediately." There was a stunned silence, followed by a frantic shuffling of papers, and then the warm, booming voice of my grandfather, the king. I broke down in tears, confessing everything: the fake identity, the engagement, the emotional abuse, and the wedding that was happening tomorrow. My grandfather didn't yell. He simply listened with cold, calculated silence. When I finished, he spoke in a tone that sent shivers down my spine. "No granddaughter of mine will be treated like a peasant by a family of new money merchants. I will handle this, Chloe. Wear your little lace dress tomorrow. Walk down that aisle, and leave the rest to me." The morning of the wedding was a blur of chaotic energy. I got ready in a small side room at the cathedral entirely alone, except for a single makeup artist. I slipped into my $200 lace dress. It was simple, lacking the heavy beads or massive trains of a traditional Harrington bride. But I felt beautiful. Just minutes before the ceremony was supposed to begin, the door to my dressing room violently swung open. Eleanor marched in, looking like a terrifying monarch in a silver designer gown. She looked me up and down, her lip curling in pure disgust. "You look completely absurd," she spat, "like a beggar playing dress-up. Just remember your place today, Chloe. You are only here because my son feels sorry for you. Smile for the cameras, keep your mouth shut, and do not embarrass us." She turned on her heel and slammed the door behind her. I didn't cry this time. I just smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. I picked up my modest bouquet of wildflowers and walked out into the grand hallway of the cathedral, lining up behind the massive oak doors leading to the nave. I could hear the organ music swelling the muffled whispers of 500 elite guests waiting to judge me. I took a deep breath, waiting for the doors to open, waiting for the Harrington family to finally realize exactly who they had been messing with. The heavy, suffocating scent of lilies and old stone filled St. Paul's Cathedral. I stood in the dim antechamber, clutching my modest bouquet of wildflowers so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white. Through the massive, intricately carved oak doors, I could hear the majestic swell of the pipe organ playing a traditional prelude. The muffled murmurs of 500 of London's most elite socialites echoed through the cavernous space. They were waiting for the punchline of Eleanor Harrington's cruel joke, the charity case bride in her cheap lace dress. I closed my eyes, steadying my breathing. I had spent 3 years terrified of my own shadow hiding from the weight of my lineage, desperate to be loved as just a normal girl. But normal had only brought me humiliation. It was time to embrace exactly who I was born to be. Suddenly, the organ music abruptly cut off, replaced by an awkward, echoing silence. I could hear a commotion outside the cathedral's main entrance, the screeching of heavy tires, the slamming of armored vehicle doors, and sharp, authoritative commands barked in a foreign language. The guests inside began to whisper, a restless wave of confusion rippling through the pews. Eleanor's meticulously planned schedule was unraveling, and I smiled. The main oak doors did not gently swing open for a bride. They were violently thrust apart with a deafening crash that echoed all the way to the vaulted ceilings. The guests gasped in unison. Instead of me standing timidly at the threshold, the entrance was entirely blocked by a phalanx of men in striking military uniforms. It was the sovereign's escort of the royal house of Amsberg. 50 elite royal guards dressed in immaculate midnight blue tunics, adorned with heavy gold epaulets, crimson sashes, and polished knee-high boots stood in perfect, terrifying synchronization. Every single man wore a ceremonial saber at his hip, their faces set in stone-cold expressions of absolute authority. At the helm stood Captain Thomas Ridgefield, a towering, decorated veteran who had served my family for 2 decades. He stepped forward, his boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. He raised a white-gloved hand, and the 50 guards marched into the cathedral in a flawless, intimidating formation. The heavy thud-thud-thud of their synchronized footsteps drowned out the frantic whispers of the Harrington guests. They marched straight down the center aisle, forcing the horrified socialites to press themselves back into their pews. Eleanor's priceless imported floral arrangements were carelessly brushed aside by the sheer force of their procession. When they reached the altar, the guards split into 2 perfectly aligned rows, flanking the aisle and facing the guests, their hands resting firmly on the hilts of their sabers. The message was clear: no one moves, no one speaks. Liam stood at the altar, his face completely drained of color. He looked like a frightened little boy, his eyes darting frantically between the armed guards and his mother. Eleanor had risen from her front row seat, her silver designer gown rustling as she clutched her diamond necklace. Her jaw was unhinged, her carefully constructed mask of superiority crumbling into sheer, unadulterated panic. Caroline Brooks, the ex-girlfriend Eleanor so desperately wanted as a daughter-in-law, sat frozen, her smug smirk completely wiped from her face. Then the true silence fell. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet broken only by the sound of a single set of footsteps entering the cathedral. My grandfather, King Henrik of the House of Amsberg, stepped through the doorway. He was a man of terrifying presence, standing over 6 feet tall, even in his late 70s. He was not dressed in a standard suit. He wore his full, formal royal regalia, a tailored charcoal uniform, adorned with the highest medals of honor, the brilliant blue sash of our sovereign order draped across his chest. His posture was rigid, his blue eyes flashing with a cold, protective fury. He did not look at the guests. He did not look at the altar. He looked only at me, waiting in the shadows of the antechamber. He walked toward me, his expression softening just a fraction as he reached out his hand. "You look beautiful, my dear," he whispered in our native tongue, his voice thick with emotion. "A true queen does not need silk to command a room." Tears pricked my eyes as I took his arm. "Thank you, grandfather," I replied quietly. King Henrik turned his gaze toward the altar, his eyes locking onto Eleanor Harrington. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. He gave a slight nod to Captain Ridgefield. The captain drew a deep breath, his booming voice shattering the silence of the cathedral, echoing off the stained glass windows. "Ladies and gentlemen." Captain Ridgefield projected his tone, demanding absolute submission. "Please rise and show proper deference. You are in the presence of His Majesty King Henrik of the Sovereign House of Amsberg and his granddaughter, Her Royal Highness Princess Chloe." A collective sharp intake of breath swept through the 500 guests. Chairs scraped against the marble floor as politicians, CEOs, and aristocrats frantically scrambled to their feet, bowing their heads out of sheer ingrained instinct. The Harrington family's wealth was vast, but in the face of ancient sovereign European royalty, they were nothing but common merchants. Eleanor's knees visibly buckled. She reached out, gripping the wooden edge of the pew to keep from collapsing onto the floor. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The girl she had bullied, mocked, and designated as a penniless charity case was a royal princess. The thrift store dress she had sneered at was now draped over a woman who vastly outranked everyone in the room. My grandfather patted my hand gently. "Shall we, Your Highness?" he asked, a fierce predatory smile playing on his lips. I lifted my chin, my shoulders pulling back. I was no longer Chloe, the bookstore clerk. I gripped my simple bouquet of wildflowers, feeling the unyielding support of the 50 royal guards surrounding us. "Yes," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Let's go greet my future in-laws." The walk down the aisle felt entirely different than the one I had anxiously pictured for the last 12 months. There was no romantic music, no soft smiles from friends, and no warm anticipation. Instead, there was the heavy rhythmic thud of my grandfather's polished boots, the intimidating presence of 50 armed guards forming an impenetrable wall around us, and the palpable suffocating fear radiating from the Harrington family. As I approached the altar, the sea of high society guests kept their heads bowed. I could see the exact moment Liam's brain finally processed the reality of the situation. His hands were shaking uncontrollably, his green eyes wide with a mixture of awe and absolute terror. He looked at my simple lace dress, then at the heavy royal sash draped across my grandfather's chest, and finally up to my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. King Henrik brought us to a halt just steps away from the altar. The officiating archbishop had retreated a few paces, looking thoroughly bewildered and intimidated by the sudden military occupation of his cathedral. My grandfather released my arm and took a deliberate, menacing step toward Eleanor Harrington. She shrank back, her haughty demeanor completely obliterated. She looked like a cornered animal, frantically searching for an escape route that didn't exist. "Mrs. Harrington." King Henrik began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that carried flawlessly through the silent cathedral. "I understand you have taken a deep personal interest in my granddaughter's pedigree. I believe the term you used to describe her was a stray bird." Eleanor stammered, her face flushing a mottled, ugly shade of crimson. "Your Majesty," she choked out, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. There has been a terrible, terrible misunderstanding. I had absolutely no idea. Silence, my grandfather commanded. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The single word cracked like a whip, and Eleanor snapped her mouth shut, looking as though she might vomit. King Henrik looked her up and down with an expression of such profound disgust that I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You boast of your wealth, Mrs. Harrington. You parade your new money around as if it grants you the right to strip others of their dignity. You looked at a young woman who offered your son nothing but pure, unadulterated love, and you saw only a target for your wretched insecurities. My grandfather pointed a gloved finger at her. You are a bully wrapped in expensive fabrics, but underneath you are entirely devoid of class. You are not fit to polish my granddaughter's shoes, let alone welcome her into your family. A quiet sob escaped Eleanor's lips. She looked desperately at Liam, pleading for him to intervene to save her from this public slaughter. Liam finally found his voice. He stepped forward, his hands raised pleadingly. Chloe, please. He begged, his eyes filling with tears. I didn't know. You have to believe me, I never cared about the money or the titles. I just love you. Please, let's just go through with this. We can fix this. I looked at the man I had loved for 3 years. I saw the charming smile, the handsome face, and the illusion of the safe harbor I thought I had found. But the illusion was dead. You're right, Liam, I said, my voice remarkably calm, projecting clearly into the silent room. You didn't care about the money, but you didn't care enough to protect me either. I turned to fully face him, making sure every guest in the front rows could hear me. You watched your mother humiliate me at every dinner. You stood by while she banned me from choosing my own wedding dress. You sat in silence last night while she called me a beggar in front of your entire family. You wanted a quiet, obedient girl who would just take the abuse to keep the peace. I continued, my voice hardening. But I am not an object you can stash in the corner to appease your mother. I needed a partner. I needed a man who would stand up for me, and you are just a coward. Liam flinched as if I had physically struck him. He dropped his gaze to the floor, the fight completely draining out of him. He knew I was right. There was no defense, no excuse he could offer that would wash away 3 years of his complicity. I turned my back on the altar, facing the sea of stunned guests. I scanned the crowd, catching the eye of Caroline Brooks. She shrank down in her seat, suddenly terrified of the woman she had spent the entire rehearsal dinner mocking. The wedding is canceled, I announced to the room. I looked back at Eleanor one last time. Enjoy the catering, Mrs. Harrington. I hear the champagne is incredibly expensive. But don't worry, my family will be sending you the bill for the cathedral rental. It's the least we could do for charity. My grandfather offered me his arm once more. A genuine proud smile graced his aged features. Shall we go home, Chloe? Yes, I replied, taking a deep breath of the incense-laced air. I'm ready. Captain Ridgefield barked a command in our native tongue. The 50 royal guards instantly snapped to attention, executing a flawless about-face. They formed a tight, protective double column around my grandfather and me. As we walked back down the aisle, the heavy, rhythmic marching of the guards echoed like a victory drum. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The entire Harrington family, along with their 500 elite guests, stood frozen in absolute silence as we exited St. Paul's Cathedral. We stepped out into the crisp London air, where a line of 6 heavily armored black state vehicles awaited us, their engines purring. A chauffeur held open the door to the lead car. Before I climbed in, I looked down at my $200 lace dress. It wasn't made of imported silk, and it didn't cost £80,000. But as I slid into the leather seat of the royal motorcade, leaving Liam and Eleanor to face the social ruin they had built for themselves, I knew one thing for certain. I had never looked more like royalty in my entire life. Settling into the plush leather seats of the royal motorcade, a profound sense of relief finally washed over my trembling shoulders. My grandfather, King Henrik, sat directly across from me, quietly pouring a glass of sparkling water from the vehicle's built-in mahogany console. He handed the crystal glass to me with a reassuring, silent nod. The heavily armored convoy sped aggressively away from St. Paul's Cathedral, leaving behind the suffocating world of the Harrington family and the shattered, exhausting remains of my false identity. My phone, safely tucked inside my small, beaded clutch, began vibrating incessantly against my thigh. The news had already leaked. You absolutely cannot march 50 sovereign royal guards into a London cathedral packed with elite high society gossips without instantly igniting an international media firestorm. Within 20 minutes of our departure, my face was splashed across the digital front page of every major news outlet in Europe. Jonathan Croft, a notoriously ruthless investigative journalist for the Daily Chronicle, broke the story first. His bold headline read, "Billionaire heir's charity bride revealed as runaway princess." High-definition videos of the royal guard storming the nave captured on the smuggled cell phones of horrified aristocratic guests went violently viral before our motorcade even reached the private airfield at Farnborough. By the time I boarded my family's private jet, a sleek custom Gulfstream G65, my 3 years of quiet, peaceful anonymity were officially dead and buried. Touching down in our sovereign European state later that evening felt incredibly surreal. The massive wrought iron gates of Amsberg Palace swung open, revealing the sprawling, meticulously manicured gardens and the grand limestone facade of my ancestral home. The palace was a formidable fortress of history, filled with centuries of art and Stoic tradition, presenting a stark contrast to the modern flashy wealth of the Harringtons. My parents, Prince Edward and Princess Catherine, were anxiously waiting in the grand foyer. My mother completely abandoned royal decorum, bursting into tears the moment she saw me and pulling me into a fierce, desperate embrace. They had reluctantly respected my agonizing decision to live as a commoner in London, but seeing the immense emotional toll the Harringtons had inflicted upon me broke their hearts. That night, sitting by the roaring fireplace in the private royal drawing room, completely surrounded by my family, I finally felt safe. Back in London, however, absolute chaos had descended upon Liam and Eleanor. According to our royal intelligence officers who were closely monitoring the public fallout, the reception at St. Paul's had quickly devolved into a humiliating spectacle. Once the initial shock wore off, the wealthy guests realized they were stranded at a canceled wedding hosted by a deeply arrogant family that had just publicly insulted a reigning European monarch. The politicians and CEOs, terrified of being professionally associated with Eleanor's monumental faux pas, fled the cathedral in droves. Caroline Brooks, the smug heiress who had sneered at me during the rehearsal dinner, was reportedly seen practically sprinting in her designer heels to her limousine just to avoid the swarming paparazzi. Over the next 4 days, Liam called my encrypted phone number exactly 72 times. He left rambling, tearful voicemails begging for a chance to explain, swearing up and down that he would cut his mother off entirely if I just came back to him. I listened to the first 3 before handing the device to Captain Ridgefield with strict, unwavering orders to block the number indefinitely. Liam's promises were painfully empty. In one desperate voicemail, he even tried to use his best man, Oliver Stanton, as a mediator. Oliver sent me an email claiming Liam hadn't slept in days and was refusing to eat. I felt a brief pang of guilt, a lingering ghost of the love I once held for him. But then I remembered the cold, dismissive look on his face when his mother called me a beggar. Liam was mourning the sudden loss of his comfort and his reputation, not the loss of his partner. Eleanor predictably was not the type to retreat in shame. Desperate to salvage her rapidly crumbling social empire, she hired a ruthless public relations crisis management firm led by a notorious media fixer named Gregory Pierce. Eleanor simply could not stand being painted as the villain of this story. She needed a scapegoat. On Tuesday morning, I sat in the palace's secure communications room, sipping tea while watching a live broadcast of a press conference Eleanor had hastily arranged outside her Surrey estate. She was dressed in a somber tailored navy suit, looking appropriately distressed, frequently dabbing at perfectly dry eyes with a lace handkerchief. My family has been subjected to a cruel, highly calculated deception. Eleanor announced to the massive sea of flashing cameras, her voice shaking with practiced theatrical vulnerability. We welcomed Chloe into our home with open arms. We tried to give her the world. To discover that she was a royal who infiltrated our private lives under false pretenses, only to humiliate my son at the altar for a cheap publicity stunt, is deeply devastating. We are the victims of a narcissistic royal family, severely abusing their power and breaking my son's heart. My jaw dropped in sheer disbelief. The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. She was actually trying to convince the British public that she was a victimized, loving mother-in-law who had been targeted by a bored, cruel princess. Gregory Pearce had clearly coached her to lean heavily into the deceptive elite angle, attempting to paint me as a manipulative fraud who had toyed with a civilian's emotions. King Henrik casually walked into the room, his hands clasped firmly behind his back as he watched the broadcast over my shoulder. He let out a low, dangerous chuckle. "She is a remarkably foolish woman," he noted, his sharp blue eyes narrowing at the television screen. "She is doubling down on a losing hand." I turned to my grandfather, the lingering doubts and the desire to quietly disappear finally evaporating from my mind. I had wanted to walk away quietly. I had wanted to just leave Liam and Eleanor in my rearview mirror and heal in peace. But Eleanor's televised pity party was the absolute final straw. She wanted to play dirty heavily, relying on the fact that the royal family traditionally never engaged in public mudslinging. She thought rigid protocol would keep my mouth shut. She was incredibly wrong. "Grandfather," I said, my voice steady, cold, and entirely resolute. "Call the press office. I want a sit-down interview, prime time, unrestricted." King Henrik smiled, a fierce gleam of pride illuminating his eyes. "I will have the director of communications set it up immediately. It is time the world officially met Princess Chloe." Friday evening arrived with the kind of heavy electric anticipation that makes the air feel thick and hard to breathe. I sat perfectly poised in a plush velvet armchair in the grand historic library of Amsberg Palace. Opposite me sat Victoria Higgins, the most respected and fiercely feared investigative journalist in international broadcasting. Victoria was a seasoned veteran of the industry, widely known for effortlessly dismantling corrupt politicians and arrogant billionaires with a polite smile and razor-sharp questions. The television network had practically fought a bidding war for this exclusive broadcast, and millions of viewers across the globe were currently tuning in live. I wore a sharply tailored ivory suit, my posture impeccable, leaving absolutely no trace of the timid bookstore girl who used to physically shrink under Eleanor's vicious glare. "Your Highness?" Victoria began, her tone deeply professional but laced with intense journalistic curiosity as the cameras rolled. "The world watched in absolute shock as your grandfather's sovereign royal guard halted your wedding. Eleanor Harrington recently stated on global television that you maliciously deceived her family and orchestrated that humiliating spectacle purely for publicity. How do you respond to these severe allegations, Wakam?" I maintained steady, unblinking eye contact with Victoria, letting a deliberate beat of silence emphasize my calm demeanor. "Victoria, deception implies malice. I hid my royal title because I desperately wanted to build a normal life based on my character, not my lineage. The spectacle at St. Paul's Cathedral was not an orchestration of malice. It was a necessary rescue mission." Victoria leaned forward slightly, sensing the immediate shift in the narrative. "A rescue mission. Mrs. Harrington explicitly claims she welcomed you with open arms. She described herself to the press as a loving, highly supportive mother figure. A cold, knowing smile touched my lips. This was exactly the moment I had been waiting for. I had not come to this interview empty-handed. Mrs. Harrington's definition of open arms involves relentless emotional abuse, vicious classist insults, and deep psychological isolation. I have brought something with me today, Victoria. My family's security detail meticulously documents all threats and hostilities directed at royal family members. Once I revealed my true identity to my grandfather, our cyber intelligence division pulled the internal security footage and audio recordings from my previous visits to the Harrington estate, as well as several unhinged voicemails she directly left me. I reached into my pocket and handed a small encrypted silver USB drive to Victoria. The network producers had already thoroughly vetted the legal contents hours before the live broadcast, and now they were fully prepared to play them for the entire world. The live broadcast seamlessly cut to an audio recording. It was Eleanor's recognizable voice, sharp, aristocratic, and completely venomous, captured via a voicemail she had left me just 3 weeks before the wedding. "Listen to me, you pathetic little gold digger." Eleanor's recorded voice sneered, echoing through millions of television sets worldwide. "Liam might be temporarily infatuated with your innocent tragic orphan act, but I see right through you. You will sign the ironclad prenuptial agreement my lawyers drafted by tomorrow, or I will make sure your miserable life in London is a living hell. You are nothing but a cheap charity case, and you will learn to bow to this family." The recording abruptly ended, leaving a heavy, profoundly stunned silence in the broadcast studio. Victoria Higgins, a hardened woman who rarely showed genuine surprise on camera, looked completely appalled. "That was just a tiny fraction of what I silently endured." I explained softly, yet firmly, my voice cutting through the quiet studio. "I stayed because I deeply loved Liam. I foolishly believed he was different from his mother, but complicity is just as damaging as direct abuse." When Eleanor publicly mocked my wedding dress, a humble dress I proudly bought from a vintage shop, because she adamantly refused to allow me to wear anything elegant, Liam said nothing. He asked me to keep quiet and just take the abuse. That is why the wedding ended. The public fallout from the exclusive interview was instantaneous and utterly catastrophic for the Harrington family. The undeniable crystal-clear audio proof instantly stripped Eleanor of her carefully constructed victim narrative, exposing her to the world as a cruel, tyrannical snob. The public backlash was absolutely ferocious. Social media erupted, tearing Eleanor and Liam apart piece by piece. The hashtag #CharityBride trended globally for weeks, constantly accompanied by viral memes of Eleanor's horrified, crumbling face at the cathedral. But the damage extended far beyond mere social humiliation. The Harrington shipping empire relied heavily on its pristine public image and incredibly lucrative government contracts. By Monday morning, when the financial markets opened, their corporate stock plummeted by a staggering 22%. Several major international shipping partners, entirely unwilling to be associated with such a toxic public relations disaster, immediately severed their contracts. Richard Abernathy, the ruthless and highly pragmatic chairman of the Harrington Board of Directors, called an emergency shareholder meeting. According to financial insiders, it was an absolute bloodbath. The board bluntly informed Liam that his mother's erratic behavior and sheer arrogance had jeopardized a multi-billion-dollar company. They aggressively forced Eleanor to immediately step down from all her prestigious philanthropic chair positions and effectively exiled her from the company's public operations permanently. Liam, heavily penalized for bringing the scandal to their doorstep, was placed on a strict probationary period by his own board, completely stripped of his executive decision-making powers. The elite London society they had fought so hard to impress slammed its mahogany doors in their faces. Absolutely nobody wanted to invite the disgraced family that had deeply insulted a reigning king and shamelessly lied on international television. Sitting on the sunlit balcony of my private palace suites a month later, sipping a cup of actual high-quality coffee, I read the latest financial report regarding the Harrington Empire with a quiet, settling sense of closure. The violent storm had finally passed. The intense media frenzy was beginning to die down, moving on to the next global scandal. Looking out over the palace gardens, I realized I didn't hate Liam anymore. I mostly just felt profound pity for him. He was permanently trapped in a golden cage of his mother's making, doomed to a sad life dictated by public perception and angry board members. Meanwhile, I was finally free. I had faced the darkest, most terrifying parts of hiding who I was, and I had survived. I didn't need to pretend to be a struggling bookshop clerk to find genuine love or meaning in my life. I could proudly use my royal platform, my extensive education, and my vast resources to actually make a difference in the world. My encrypted phone vibrated gently on the glass table. It was a brief text from Captain Ridgefield letting me know the royal helicopter was ready to take me to a major charity gala in Geneva. I was officially launching a global literacy initiative heavily funding independent bookstores, a quiet personal nod to the simple life I had left behind. I smiled, stepping away from the balcony. My cheap $200 lace wedding dress was safely packed away in a cedar chest at the foot of my bed, a permanent reminder of my true worth. I didn't need 50 royal guards to protect my spirit anymore. I had finally learned exactly how to protect myself. 6 months after the disastrous non-wedding that permanently shattered the Harrington family's social standing, I had successfully settled into my new reality. My global literacy initiative was thriving, and I spent my days traveling between Geneva, Paris, and our sovereign state entirely focused on philanthropic work. I genuinely believed Eleanor Harrington had crawled into a dark corner to lick her wounds and accept her permanent exile from polite society. However, I had severely underestimated the destructive desperation of a narcissist who had lost absolutely everything. A cornered animal is always the most dangerous, and Eleanor was practically foaming at the mouth for revenge. Returning to my private suite after a long symposium on childhood education, I found Captain Ridgefield waiting by my mahogany desk. His usually stoic expression was exceptionally grim. He held a thick manila envelope sealed with the heavy wax stamp of a prominent British law firm. "Your Highness," Captain Ridgefield stated, his voice laced with tightly controlled anger. "We received this via international courier an hour ago. The Harrington family has formally filed a massive civil lawsuit against you in the High Court of London." I froze, carefully taking the envelope and slicing it open with a silver letter opener. As I read the heavily, legally worded documents, my blood ran completely cold. Eleanor wasn't just suing me for defamation, claiming my televised interview had intentionally destroyed their multi-billion-dollar shipping empire. She had also officially accused me of grand larceny. The lawsuit explicitly alleged that I had stolen the antique sapphire engagement ring Liam had given me, a ring that supposedly belonged to the Harrington estate and was valued at a staggering £2 million. She was demanding £50 million in compensatory damages and a public retraction of my abuse allegations. To make matters worse, Eleanor had hired Alistair Montgomery, one of London's most notoriously aggressive and morally bankrupt society lawyers. Montgomery was famous for utterly destroying the reputations of anyone who dared cross his wealthy clients. He had already strategically leaked the lawsuit to the British tabloids, attempting to spin a narrative that I was a vindictive, unstable royal who had maliciously stolen a priceless family heirloom before fleeing the country. My grandfather, King Henrik, was absolutely livid when I showed him the summons. He immediately offered to invoke my sovereign diplomatic immunity, which would instantly force the British courts to throw the entire case into the garbage. He wanted to crush Eleanor with the full, unyielding weight of international law. But I shook my head. Hiding behind my royal title was exactly what Eleanor expected me to do. She wanted the public to believe I was a cowardly elite running from the consequences of my actions. I refused to give her that satisfaction. I was going to face her on her own turf and permanently dismantle her pathetic lies under oath. "I'm not invoking immunity," I told my grandfather, my voice hardening with absolute resolve. "I'm going back to London, and I'm bringing the best legal counsel Europe has to offer." Within 48 hours, I had retained the services of Sir Geoffrey Robertson, an internationally renowned King's Counsel, who had previously defended heads of state and dismantled some of the most complex corporate frauds in modern history. Sir Geoffrey was a legal titan, a man whose mere presence in a courtroom commanded absolute silence and respect. We flew back to London on the royal jet, accompanied by Captain Ridgefield and a detail of our top cyber intelligence officers. The deposition was scheduled to take place in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at Montgomery's lavish law firm in Canary Wharf. I arrived wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, flanked by Sir Geoffrey and my security detail. When I walked into the room, Eleanor was already seated at the massive mahogany table. She looked significantly older than she had 6 months ago. Her designer clothes hung slightly loose on her frame, and the deep, bitter lines around her mouth were permanently etched into her skin. Liam sat beside her, looking completely hollowed out, staring blankly at the legal pads in front of him. Eleanor's eyes flashed with a venomous, triumphant gleam when she saw me. She genuinely believed she had successfully dragged me back down into the mud with her. She thought her fabricated theft charges would force me into a quiet, multi-million-pound settlement just to avoid the scandalous headlines. Alistair Montgomery immediately went on the offensive. He practically paced around the conference table, attempting to use aggressive intimidation tactics. He aggressively questioned me about the day of the canceled wedding, loudly demanding to know exactly where I had hidden the sapphire ring before I fled St. Paul's Cathedral in my royal motorcade. Princess Chloe. Montgomery sneered, leaning heavily on the table. You expect this room to believe that you simply forgot about a £2 million heirloom. My client has sworn under penalty of perjury that you maliciously refused to return the ring, deliberately stealing a priceless piece of Harrington history to spite her. I remained perfectly still, my expression entirely unbothered. I looked past the aggressive lawyer and locked eyes directly with Liam. He flinched nervously, swallowing hard. Mr. Montgomery. Sir Geoffrey interrupted, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone that instantly dominated the room. Before my client answers that entirely fabricated accusation, I believe we need to address a severe discrepancy in your client's sworn affidavit, a discrepancy that directly implicates Eleanor Harrington in a felony. Eleanor's smug smile instantly vanished. Montgomery frowned tightly, crossing his arms. There are no discrepancies, Sir Geoffrey. We have a solid case of grand larceny. Sir Geoffrey casually opened his sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a single heavily encrypted flash drive. He placed it gently on the center of the mahogany table, letting the metallic click echo in the tense silence. Are you absolutely certain about that? Sir Geoffrey asked, a dangerous predatory smile forming on his face. Because I believe your client has made a catastrophic miscalculation. Tension in the glass-walled conference room rapidly reached a boiling point. Sir Geoffrey Robertson smoothly slid a glossy 8x10 photograph across the table toward Alistair Montgomery. Eleanor stretched her neck to see it, and the moment her eyes registered the image, all the remaining color aggressively drained from her face. She let out a sharp, involuntary gasp, her perfectly manicured hands trembling violently against the edge of the table. This photograph? Sir Geoffrey announced, his tone dripping with lethal professionalism, was taken by a private insurance appraiser at the Harrington estate in Surrey exactly 3 weeks ago. As you can clearly see, sitting prominently inside Eleanor Harrington's personal biometric wall safe is the exact sapphire engagement ring my client is currently being accused of stealing. Montgomery physically recoiled, staring at the photograph in absolute disbelief. He turned his head slowly, glaring fiercely at Eleanor. What is this, Eleanor? He hissed through clenched teeth, his professional composure violently fracturing. It's a fake. It's a doctored photo. Eleanor shrieked, her voice pitching into a hysterical, unhinged octave. She pointed a shaking finger at me. She manipulated the image. She has an entire Royal Intelligence Agency at her disposal. They hacked my security system and planted that picture. I calmly leaned forward, resting my hands on the cool mahogany table. I didn't steal your ring, Eleanor. When I changed into my wedding dress at St. Paul's Cathedral, I took the ring off and placed it directly into Liam's jacket pocket while he was in the groom's suite. I specifically told him I couldn't wear it down the aisle because it was heavily snagging the delicate lace of my dress. I turned my gaze to Liam. He looked as though he was going to be physically sick. Tell them, Liam. I commanded, my voice completely devoid of any remaining affection. Tell your lawyer exactly where that ring has been for the last 6 months. Liam squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear escaping and rolling down his pale cheek. The crushing weight of his mother's endless toxicity had finally broken him. He opened his eyes, entirely ignoring Eleanor's frantic, threatening glares. She's telling the truth, Liam whispered, his voice cracking painfully. Liam, shut your mouth this instant, Eleanor screamed, violently grabbing his arm. Liam violently shook her off, standing up from his leather chair. No, Mother, I'm completely done. I'm done lying for you, and I'm done letting you destroy everyone around you. He looked directly at Montgomery, who was frantically packing his legal briefs back into his briefcase, realizing he had been tricked into facilitating perjury. I took the ring home after the wedding. I locked it in the estate safe. My mother knew exactly where it was the entire time. She intentionally filed a fraudulent police report because she wanted to bankrupt Chloe's charity. The silence that followed Liam's confession was absolutely deafening. Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with dry, defeated sobs. She had meticulously dug her own grave, and her own son had just pushed her into it. Sir Geoffrey calmly gathered his documents. Mr. Montgomery, I fully expect this frivolous lawsuit to be officially dismissed with prejudice before the courts open tomorrow morning. Furthermore, my legal team will be filing a comprehensive countersuit against Mrs. Harrington for malicious prosecution, severe defamation, and the attempted extortion of a sovereign royal family member. We will be seeking full legal fees and a public apology. Montgomery didn't argue. He didn't even attempt to defend his client. He simply nodded curtly, entirely disgusted by Eleanor's blatant criminality. As I stood up to leave, I looked at Liam one final time. There was no anger left in my heart, only a profound sense of finality. He had finally found his backbone, but it was 3 years too late. The immediate fallout from the aborted deposition was the final nail in the Harrington family's social and financial coffin. To avoid facing direct criminal charges for perjury and filing a false police report, Eleanor was legally forced to sign a devastating public retraction, completely admitting that she had fabricated the entire theft. The highly publicized scandal completely decimated whatever microscopic shred of credibility the Harringtons had left. Liam officially resigned from the family company, cut all financial ties with his mother, and reportedly moved to a quiet rural town in Scotland to escape the relentless paparazzi. As for me, I officially reclaimed my place in society completely on my own terms. 2 weeks after the lawsuit was humiliatingly dropped, I attended an incredibly exclusive charity gala hosted by Hugh Grosvenor, the Duke of Westminster, at his sprawling London estate. I didn't hide in the corner, and I certainly didn't wear a cheap thrift store dress. I wore a breathtaking custom-made emerald silk gown adorned with the ancestral diamonds of the House of Amsberg. Walking into the grand ballroom completely surrounded by actual established aristocrats and genuine philanthropists, nobody sneered at me. Nobody whispered cruel jokes about charity cases or stray birds. Instead, they parted respectfully, offering warm smiles and deep bows. Hugh Grosvenor personally greeted me, expressing profound admiration for the global literacy initiative I was aggressively expanding across Europe. Later that evening, standing on the sweeping stone terrace overlooking the manicured gardens, I felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. I'd spent 3 years desperately trying to shrink myself to fit into a world that only valued superficial wealth. I had endured the vicious cruelty of a woman who mistook kindness for weakness. But in the end, Eleanor Harrington's relentless mockery had been the exact catalyst I needed. She had intended to break me, but instead, she had forcefully reminded me of the immense power, grace, and unbreakable strength that flowed through my veins. I was Princess Chloe, and I would never ever let anyone make me feel small again. Spring arrived in London with a vibrant, refreshing energy that perfectly mirrored the absolute triumph of my new life. Exactly 1 year after the disastrous wedding that never happened, I was back in Mayfair. I wasn't sweeping the floors of a cramped independent bookshop anymore. I was cutting the crimson ribbon at the grand opening of the Amsberg Royal Literacy Foundation, a massive multi-million-pound philanthropic center located directly on Mount Street, just a stone's throw from the prestigious Connaught Hotel. It was a glittering evening packed with prominent figures from politics, literature, and actual high society. Emma Weymouth, the Marchioness of Bath, stood by my side enthusiastically discussing a partnership between our foundations, while flashes from the approved press pool illuminated the opulent, newly renovated historic building. Everything was going flawlessly until Captain Ridgefield caught my eye from across the crowded marble foyer. He gave a sharp, nearly imperceptible nod toward the secondary entrance. I excused myself from a fascinating conversation with a prominent British author and quietly made my way toward the private security alcove. Standing there, flanked by 2 towering members of my royal guard, was Eleanor Harrington. I almost didn't recognize her. The terrifying, immaculate tyrant draped in vintage Chanel was completely gone. She wore a severely outdated, slightly wrinkled beige trench coat, and her previously flawless blonde hair was visibly graying at the roots. She looked frail, exhausted, and incredibly desperate. The Harrington corporate board had completely severed her allowance, following the perjury scandal, freezing her out of the family's primary financial trusts. Without Liam to manipulate and without her company credit cards, her empire of intimidation had rapidly crumbled into dust. "Your Highness," Captain Ridgefield said, his voice laced with heavy disdain. This woman attempted to bypass the catering entrance using a forged press credential. We were about to hand her over to the Metropolitan Police for trespassing. Eleanor looked up at me, her eyes red and frantically swimming with unshed tears. She didn't sneer. She didn't hurl insults about my pedigree. Instead, her knees buckled slightly, and she clasped her trembling hands together in a pathetic, dramatic display of submission. "Chloe, please." Eleanor begged, her voice a raspy, broken whisper. "You have to speak to me. Just give me 5 minutes. I have absolutely nowhere else to go." I stared at her, feeling a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. There was no anger left, just a profound clinical curiosity. I motioned for the guards to step back, though they kept their hands firmly resting on their tactical belts. "You have 3 minutes, Eleanor," I replied coldly. "Speak." Tears finally spilled over her heavily wrinkled cheeks. "I am ruined," she sobbed, clutching the lapels of her cheap coat. "The board legally evicted me from the Surrey estate yesterday. They claim I am a liability to the corporate brand. All my friends have blocked my number. My credit lines are completely frozen, and Liam refuses to return my calls from Scotland. You won. You absolutely destroyed me. I am begging you, Chloe. Your royal trust is worth billions. Write me a check. Just enough to buy a small flat in Chelsea. Please, I will sign any non-disclosure agreement you want. I will disappear." I listened to her desperate pleas entirely unmoved. She wasn't sorry for the years of horrific emotional abuse she had inflicted upon me. She was only sorry that her venom had finally backfired and poisoned her own life. And do you remember the bridal boutique on Bond Street, Eleanor? I asked, my voice dangerously soft and even. Do you remember sitting on that velvet sofa, drinking espresso, and loudly telling the attendants that you would never spend your money on a stray bird who brought nothing to your family? Eleanor flinched violently, closing her eyes as the memory struck her like a physical blow. "I offered to pay for my own dress that day, and you laughed in my face." I continued, taking a deliberate step closer to her. "You called me a pathetic charity case. You wanted to ensure I knew I was beneath you simply because you thought I was poor. You only value human beings based on what they can deposit into your bank account. And now that your bank account is empty, you realize you have absolutely nothing else to offer the world." Eleanor sobbed louder, reaching out a shaking hand toward my custom emerald silk gown. "I was wrong. I was so foolish. Please, Your Highness, show some mercy." "I am showing you mercy, Eleanor," I stated, completely ignoring her outstretched hand. "I am not having you arrested for trespassing at a highly secure diplomatic event, but I'm absolutely not giving you a single penny." I turned my back on her, signaling to Captain Ridgefield. "Wait!" she shrieked desperately as the guards took her arms. "Who bought the Surrey estate?" "The board said a private equity firm purchased the mortgage and forced the foreclosure. You know everything, Chloe. Who bought my home?" I paused, turning my head slightly to look at her over my shoulder. A slow, chilling smile touched my lips. "It was a subsidiary holding company," I informed her effortlessly. "Owned entirely by the Amsberg Royal Literacy Foundation. We are bulldozing the Harrington Manor next month to build a tuition-free boarding school for underprivileged youth. A true charity case, wouldn't you agree?" Eleanor let out a devastated, breathless gasp, finally realizing the absolute totality of her defeat. Her legacy, her pristine estate, was being erased by the very girl she had mocked. She went completely limp as the royal guard smoothly escorted her out the back door and into the damp London night. I took a deep cleansing breath, smoothing the skirt of my gown. I walked back into the grand foyer, instantly enveloped by the warm, glowing light of the chandeliers and the joyous laughter of genuine friends. I grabbed a glass of vintage champagne from a passing silver tray and raised it, slightly toasting silently to the incredible, unyielding power of knowing your true worth. Can you believe the absolute sheer audacity of Eleanor trying to beg for a luxury Chelsea flat after everything she put me through? Turning her precious, snobby Surrey estate into a tuition-free charity school was the ultimate satisfying revenge. If you loved seeing this toxic mother-in-law finally get the brutal reality check she so deeply deserved, you absolutely need to smash that like button right now. Leave a comment down below, telling me what you would have done if 50 royal guards crashed your wedding, and do not forget to share and subscribe to the channel for even more insane real-life drama stories.